Dr. Sarah Martinez had always believed that medicine could heal any wound, but nothing prepared her for what she would face in the mountains of Afghanistan. As a trauma surgeon with Doctors Without Borders, she had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, driven by a desire to help where others feared to go. Her colleagues often questioned her decision to work in active war zones, but Sarah felt a calling that went beyond comfortable hospital walls. The forward operating base sat like a small fortress in the rugged terrain, surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Sarah had been there for 3 months, treating soldiers and civilians alike. The base was home to a special operations team known simply as the Ghosts, elite Navy SEALs who rarely spoke about their missions, but whose respect for the brave doctor had grown with each life she saved. Team leader Commander Jake Morrison was a 15-year veteran who had seen too much war. His team consisted of 5 other highly trained operators: Marcus, the communications expert; Tony, the demolition specialist; Alex, the sniper; Chris, the medic; and David, the youngest member who served as their tech specialist. They had worked together for over 2 years, becoming more like brothers than teammates. The morning started like any other. Sarah was reviewing patient files when the alarm sounded. Incoming wounded. A convoy had hit an improvised explosive device 20 miles out, and casualties were being airlifted in. She quickly prepared the medical bay, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she laid out surgical instruments and checked equipment. The first helicopter landed in a cloud of dust and noise. Sarah watched through the window as the SEALs helped carry stretchers toward her makeshift operating room. Among the wounded was a young Afghan girl, no more than 8 years old, who had been caught in the explosion while walking to school. Her injuries were severe, and Sarah knew she would need to work quickly to save her life. As Sarah began treating the girl, she noticed something unusual. The child clutched a small wooden doll in her arms, refusing to let go even as medical staff tried to examine her. Through a translator, Sarah learned that the doll had been a gift from her father, who had died in the explosion. The girl believed that as long as she held the doll, her father's spirit would protect her. The surgery took 4 hours. Sarah worked tirelessly, repairing internal damage and stopping bleeding that threatened to take the young life. Commander Morrison and his team waited outside, checking on the doctor's progress whenever possible. They had seen her work miracles before, but this case seemed different. The girl reminded Morrison of his own daughter back home, and he found himself praying for a successful outcome. When Sarah finally emerged from surgery, exhaustion was written across her face, but her eyes held hope. The girl was stable, but the next 24 hours would be critical. Sarah decided to stay by her bedside through the night, monitoring her condition and adjusting treatment as needed. The wooden doll remained clutched in the child's small hands. During the long night watch, Morrison visited the medical base several times. He and Sarah had developed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared experiences of life at the forward operating base. They often discussed the challenges of their work and the toll it took on their souls. Morrison admired Sarah's unwavering commitment to saving lives, regardless of nationality or circumstances. As dawn approached, the girl's condition began to improve. Her vital signs stabilized and she showed signs of regaining consciousness. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized they had succeeded in pulling the child back from the brink of death. The wooden doll had indeed seemed to bring protection, though Sarah knew it was skilled medical care that had made the difference. The recovery process would be long, but the girl would live. Sarah arranged for her to be transferred to a larger medical facility in Kabul, where she could receive the ongoing care she needed. As they prepared for the transfer, the girl finally spoke her first words since the explosion, asking in broken English if the kind doctor would visit her. Sarah promised she would try, though she knew the demands of her work at the base made such visits unlikely. The successful surgery strengthened the bond between Sarah and the SEAL team. They had witnessed her dedication and skill firsthand, and their respect for her grew even deeper. Morrison began to see her not just as the base doctor, but as someone who embodied the best of what they were all fighting for, the protection of innocent life. However, Sarah's reputation for miraculous saves was beginning to spread beyond the base. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces had taken notice of the American doctor, who was saving lives in their territory. This attention would soon put her directly in harm's way, setting the stage for events that would test everyone's courage and change their lives forever. Little did Sarah know that her commitment to healing would soon lead her into the most dangerous situation of her life, where the line between medical care and battlefield heroics would blur completely. The mountains of Afghanistan held many secrets, and Sarah was about to discover that sometimes saving lives required risking everything, even when elite warriors laid down their weapons in surrender. 3 weeks after the successful surgery on the young Afghan girl, intelligence reports began painting a troubling picture. Enemy forces in the region had been asking questions about the American doctor who operated at the forward base. Local informants reported increased chatter about targeting medical personnel, a violation of international law that unfortunately had become common in this brutal conflict. Commander Morrison studied the intelligence briefings with growing concern. The reports indicated that a particularly ruthless Taliban commander named Hassan Nazir had become fixated on Dr. Martinez. Nazir believed that eliminating the doctor would deal a significant blow to American morale and medical capabilities in the region. His network had been gathering information about base routines, medical evacuations, and Sarah's movements. Sarah remained focused on her medical duties, unaware of the growing threat. She continued to treat wounded soldiers and civilians with the same dedication that had defined her career. The base commander, Colonel Williams, decided not to inform her about the specific threats, believing it would only create unnecessary stress while she performed her life-saving work. The SEAL team, however, was briefed on the situation. Morrison felt a protective instinct towards Sarah that went beyond normal operational security concerns. He quietly increased security around the medical facility and ensured that at least one team member was always positioned where they could quickly respond to any threat against the doctor. Marcus, the team's communications expert, intercepted radio chatter that provided more details about Nazir's plans. The Taliban commander was reportedly planning to capture rather than kill Dr. Martinez, intending to use her as a high-value prisoner for propaganda purposes. This information made the threat even more serious, as it suggested a sophisticated operation rather than a simple attack. During this tense period, Sarah noticed subtle changes around the base. There seemed to be more armed personnel near the medical facility, and the SEALs appeared more vigilant than usual. When she asked Morrison about it, he deflected her concerns, saying they were simply conducting enhanced security drills. Sarah accepted the explanation, trusting that the military personnel knew best how to maintain base security. The breakthrough in enemy planning came from an unexpected source. A local Afghan interpreter named Rashid, who had worked with American forces for 2 years, brought crucial intelligence to the base. His cousin, who lived in a village controlled by Nazir's forces, had overheard detailed planning for an operation targeting the American doctor. According to Rashid's information, Nazir planned to attack during a medical evacuation. The Taliban commander knew that Dr. Martinez always accompanied critical patients to the helicopter landing zone, making her vulnerable during the transfer process. The attack would be timed to occur when she was outside the protected medical facility, separated from the base's main defensive positions. Morrison immediately convened an emergency meeting with his team and base leadership. They had to decide whether to restrict Sarah's movements or use the intelligence to set a trap for Nazir's forces. The decision was complicated by the fact that limiting Sarah's ability to accompany critical patients could result in preventable deaths. Sarah's medical expertise was often crucial during patient transfers. Her presence during helicopter evacuations had saved lives when patients experienced complications during transport. Grounding her would mean accepting that some wounded soldiers and civilians might die from treatable conditions. It was an impossible choice between her safety and her mission to save lives. The team decided on a compromise solution. They would maintain normal evacuation procedures but significantly increase security during transfers. Additional snipers would be positioned around the landing zone, and the SEAL team would provide close protection for Sarah during all medical evacuations. They hoped this approach would allow Sarah to continue her work while deterring any attack. However, Nazir proved more cunning than anticipated. His network included informants who observed the increased security measures around medical evacuations. Rather than abandoning his plan, the Taliban commander adapted his strategy. He decided to create a crisis that would force multiple evacuations simultaneously, stretching security resources thin and creating opportunities for his operation. The new plan involved coordinated attacks on multiple coalition positions, creating numerous casualties that would require immediate medical attention and evacuation. Nazir calculated that the Americans would be forced to prioritize saving lives over security protocols, giving his forces the opening they needed to capture Dr. Martinez. Intelligence reports suggested the coordinated attacks would begin within 72 hours. Morrison and his team prepared for what they knew would be one of the most challenging operations of their careers. They had to protect Sarah while maintaining their primary mission of defending the base and supporting coalition forces throughout the region. Sarah sensed the increased tension but remained focused on preparing for potential mass casualty events. She organized additional medical supplies, briefed her small support staff on emergency procedures, and reviewed protocols for treating multiple trauma patients simultaneously. Her dedication to preparation would soon prove crucial in ways she could never have imagined. As the team finalized their security plans, Morrison made a decision that would later prove prophetic. He instructed his men to be prepared for any scenario, including situations where conventional military tactics might not be sufficient. Sometimes, he told them, protecting what mattered most required thinking beyond standard operating procedures. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test everyone's courage, skill, and commitment to their mission. In the harsh mountains of Afghanistan, Dr. Sarah Martinez was about to face a challenge that would require her to step far beyond her role as a healer, while elite warriors would discover that sometimes the greatest act of courage involved laying down their weapons. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Multiple explosions echoed across the valley as Hassan Nazir's forces launched coordinated strikes against 3 different coalition positions. The forward operating base came alive with urgent radio chatter as reports of casualties poured in from all directions. Sarah was reviewing patient charts when the first explosion shook the medical facility. Within minutes, Colonel Williams was briefing her on the developing situation. At least 30 wounded soldiers and civilians were being prepared for evacuation from the various attack sites. Multiple helicopters would be needed, and Sarah would need to triage patients to determine priority for medical evacuation. Commander Morrison's team quickly implemented their enhanced security protocol. Marcus established communication links with all helicopter pilots and ground units, while Tony and Alex positioned themselves as overwatch for the landing zone. Chris prepared additional medical supplies to support Sarah's work, and David monitored electronic communications for any signs of enemy movement toward the base. The first helicopter arrived, carrying 8 wounded soldiers from an outpost that had been hit by rocket-propelled grenades. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, quickly assessing each patient's condition and determining who needed immediate evacuation to the larger medical facility in Kabul. 3 soldiers required her personal accompaniment during transport due to the severity of their injuries. As Sarah prepared to board the helicopter with the critical patients, Morrison approached her with additional security personnel. He explained that given the coordinated nature of the attacks, they were implementing maximum security protocols for all medical evacuations. Sarah nodded her understanding, focused entirely on keeping her patients alive during the flight. The first evacuation proceeded without incident, but radio reports indicated that more casualties were incoming. A convoy escorting civilian aid workers had been ambushed, resulting in multiple injuries, including several children. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the day was going to test every skill she had developed during her years of emergency medicine. Upon returning from the first evacuation, Sarah found the landing zone filled with activity as ground crews prepared for the next helicopter arrival. She noticed that security had been increased even further, with additional snipers visible on nearby buildings and more armed personnel patrolling the perimeter. The SEAL team maintained close proximity to her position at all times. The second helicopter brought a more challenging mix of patients. Among the wounded were 2 young Afghan children, victims of the convoy ambush, and a severely injured aid worker who had shielded them from the explosion. Sarah's medical assessment revealed that all 3 needed immediate surgical intervention that could only be provided at the main hospital facility. As Sarah prepared for her second evacuation flight of the day, Marcus intercepted radio communications that sent chills through the SEAL team. Enemy forces were moving toward the base, apparently timing their approach to coincide with the next medical evacuation. The trap that intelligence had warned about was being sprung, but the team now faced the challenge of protecting Sarah while she attended to critical patients. Morrison made a split-second decision that would later be debated by military analysts. Rather than cancel the evacuation and risk the lives of the 3 critical patients, he decided to proceed with additional security measures. His team would accompany Sarah to the helicopter and maintain defensive positions around the landing zone throughout the evacuation process. The approach of the 3rd helicopter was when everything changed. As the aircraft descended toward the landing zone, sniper fire erupted from the surrounding mountains. The helicopter pilot, Captain Rodriguez, struggled to maintain control as bullets struck the aircraft's fuselage. Ground crews scrambled for cover while the SEAL team returned fire toward the enemy positions. Sarah, despite the chaos around her, remained focused on preparing her patients for transport. The 2 children were unconscious, their conditions deteriorating rapidly while the aid worker had lost significant blood and needed immediate surgical attention. She knew that delaying their evacuation by even 30 minutes could mean the difference between life and death. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio as he coordinated the base's defensive response. Multiple enemy positions had been identified in the mountains surrounding the base, and it was clear that this was the sophisticated attack that intelligence had warned about. The enemy had chosen their timing perfectly, striking when medical personnel would be most vulnerable. As the firefight intensified, Captain Rodriguez made an emergency landing in the designated zone, but his aircraft had sustained damage that made immediate takeoff impossible. Ground crews rushed to assess the helicopter while Sarah continued preparing her patients, seemingly oblivious to the bullets flying overhead. Her medical training had taken over, and nothing else mattered except saving the lives in her care. The situation deteriorated rapidly when a rocket-propelled grenade exploded near the helicopter, damaging its tail rotor and making flight impossible. Rodriguez shut down the engines and evacuated his crew, while Morrison realized that they were now trapped in an exposed position, with critical patients who could not be moved to safety. Enemy forces began advancing down the mountainsides, using cover and concealment to move closer to the base perimeter. Morrison's team found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation, torn between their duty to defend the base and their commitment to protecting Dr. Martinez and her patients. The next few hours would test their training, courage, and loyalty in ways they had never imagined. Sarah, still focused on her patients despite the chaos, began improvising medical procedures in the field. She set up a temporary surgical station using supplies from the damaged helicopter, determined to stabilize her patients regardless of the danger surrounding them. Her actions were about to inspire a level of courage from the SEAL team that would become the stuff of military legend. As enemy forces closed in and the situation became increasingly desperate, the stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything Morrison and his team believed about warfare, duty, and the true meaning of heroism under fire. The disabled helicopter sat in the landing zone like a wounded bird, its damaged rotors useless against the mountain wind. Commander Morrison assessed their situation with growing concern as enemy forces continued their advance down the mountainsides. Radio communications indicated that additional Taliban fighters were moving to surround the base, turning what should have been a medical evacuation into a potential siege. Dr. Sarah Martinez worked frantically to stabilize her 3 critical patients using whatever medical supplies she could salvage from the helicopter and her emergency kit. The 2 Afghan children remained unconscious, their small bodies fighting for life, while the wounded aid worker had developed complications that required immediate surgical intervention. Sarah knew that without proper medical facilities, she was fighting a losing battle against time. Morrison's team established a defensive perimeter around the landing zone, but their position was far from ideal. They were exposed on multiple sides with limited cover and no easy retreat route to the main base defensive positions. Alex, the team's sniper, reported at least 20 enemy fighters moving through the rocks above them, while Marcus monitored radio chatter indicating more forces approaching from other directions. The base commander, Colonel Williams, faced an impossible decision from his command center: sending additional troops to reinforce Morrison's position, would weaken the base's main defenses just as enemy forces were massing for what appeared to be a coordinated assault. However, abandoning the medical team and their patients was equally unthinkable. Sarah's medical assessment revealed that the aid worker needed immediate surgery to stop internal bleeding, while one of the children showed signs of brain swelling that required specialized intervention. Working in the shadow of the damaged helicopter, she began performing emergency procedures that would normally require a fully equipped operating room. Her hands remained steady despite the sound of gunfire echoing around the landing zone. Tony, the team's demolitions expert, used his explosives to create additional defensive positions around the helicopter, but everyone knew they were buying time rather than solving their fundamental problem. Enemy forces controlled the high ground and seemed content to wait for reinforcements before launching their final assault. The Taliban's patients suggested they understood the strategic value of their position. As afternoon turned toward evening, Morrison received intelligence that changed everything. Hassan Nazir himself was reportedly among the enemy forces, having come personally to oversee the capture of Dr. Martinez. This information confirmed that the attack was specifically designed to target Sarah, making her safety the primary objective for the Taliban forces surrounding them. Sarah remained focused on her patients, seemingly unaware of the strategic importance of her own safety. She had successfully stabilized the aid worker's condition and was now working to reduce brain swelling in one of the children using improvised techniques. Her dedication to saving lives continued even as the military situation deteriorated around her. Morrison found himself facing a leadership challenge unlike any in his military career. His training emphasized aggressive action and decisive engagement with enemy forces, but Sarah's presence and the critical patients created variables that standard military doctrine didn't address. Protecting non-combatants while maintaining tactical effectiveness required thinking beyond conventional warfare. The situation became more complex when Marcus intercepted communications indicating that Nazir was willing to negotiate. The Taliban commander apparently wanted to avoid casualties among the medical personnel and patients, hoping instead to capture Dr. Martinez alive for propaganda purposes. This intelligence presented Morrison with options he had never considered in 15 years of special operations. As darkness approached, Colonel Williams authorized a desperate plan. A diversionary attack would be launched against enemy positions on the opposite side of the base, hopefully drawing some of Taliban forces away from the landing zone. This would create a window of opportunity for Morrison's team to either fight their way back to the main defensive positions or establish a more defensible position for the night. However, Sarah's medical assessment revealed that moving the patients could be fatal. The children were too unstable for transport, and the aid worker's condition remained critical despite her emergency interventions. Sarah informed Morrison that attempting to evacuate the patients would likely result in their deaths, leaving him with an impossible choice between tactical necessity and medical ethics. Morrison's team prepared for what they expected to be a long night of defensive fighting. Each man checked his ammunition and equipment while maintaining their protective positions around the medical area. They had trained for countless scenarios, but none of their preparation had included protecting a doctor performing emergency surgery while surrounded by enemy forces. Sarah continued working through the evening, using flashlights and emergency lighting to illuminate her makeshift surgical area. Her determination to save her patients inspired the SEAL team, who watched her work with growing admiration. Here was someone who refused to abandon her mission even when faced with capture or death. The diversionary attack began at sunset, with explosions and gunfire echoing from the far side of the base. Morrison monitored radio traffic as coalition forces engaged Taliban positions, hoping the plan would succeed in drawing enemy attention away from their location. However, early reports suggested that Nazir was too experienced to fall for such tactics. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Morrison received a message that would change everything. Hassan Nazir wanted to communicate directly with the American commander at the landing zone. The Taliban leader was apparently ready to discuss terms for the release of the medical personnel and patients. But his conditions would test Morrison's understanding of duty, honor, and sacrifice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would require Morrison and his team to make decisions that went far beyond their military training. In the darkness of the Afghan mountains, Surrounded by enemy forces, they were about to discover that sometimes protecting what matters most requires abandoning everything you thought you knew about warfare. The radio crackled to life in the darkness as Hassan Nazir's voice broke through the static. Speaking in accented but clear English, the Taliban commander addressed Morrison directly, bypassing normal military communication protocols. His words carried the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages in their deadly game of chess. "American commander," Nazir's voice was calm and measured. "I know you are protecting the doctor. I respect her work healing our people, but she has become too valuable to your forces. I am prepared to discuss terms for her safe passage to our custody, along with the wounded children she treats." Morrison felt his team's eyes on him as he considered his response. Standard military protocol was clear about not negotiating with enemy forces, but Sarah's situation and the critical patients created circumstances that normal doctrine didn't address. Colonel Williams monitored the conversation from the base command center, equally torn between military regulations and humanitarian concerns. Sarah, still working on her patients in the dim light, overheard portions of the radio exchange. For the first time since the crisis began, she looked up from her medical work to meet Morrison's eyes. In that moment, she understood that she had become the center of a larger conflict, and her safety was now directly tied to the lives of everyone around her. "What do you want?" Morrison responded, his voice betraying none of the uncertainty he felt. His team maintained their defensive positions while listening to every word of the exchange. They had trained for hostage situations, but never one where they might be asked to surrender their primary protectee to save others. Nazir's demands were surprisingly specific. He wanted Dr. Martinez and the 2 wounded Afghan children transferred to his custody. In exchange, he would allow Morrison's team and the wounded aid workers safe passage back to the base. The Taliban commander claimed he needed a skilled doctor to treat his own wounded fighters, and the children would ensure her cooperation. The proposal created an ethical dilemma that military training had never prepared Morrison to face. Surrendering Sarah would likely save his team and the aid worker, but it would place her in enemy hands where her fate would be uncertain at best. However, refusing the offer might result in casualties among his men and the death of patients who could potentially be saved. Sarah made the decision for him. Speaking clearly so that Nazir could hear her over the radio, she announced her willingness to surrender herself in exchange for the safety of everyone else. Her voice was steady as she explained that her medical oath required her to do whatever was necessary to preserve life, even if it meant sacrificing her own freedom. Morrison immediately rejected Sarah's proposal, but she continued speaking directly to the Taliban commander. She offered to treat his wounded fighters in exchange for the safety of her current patients and Morrison's team. Her knowledge of trauma surgery and emergency medicine, she argued, would be more valuable to Nazir if she came willingly, rather than as a hostile prisoner. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, as Nazir outlined his terms, and Morrison sought alternatives. The Taliban commander proved surprisingly reasonable, acknowledging the rules of war regarding medical personnel while maintaining that Dr. Martinez had become a legitimate military target due to her strategic value to coalition forces. During this tense negotiation, Sarah continued her medical work, successfully stabilizing both children and improving the aid workers' condition. Her ability to save lives under extreme pressure demonstrated exactly why Nazir considered her such a valuable prize. Every successful treatment proved her worth as both a healer and a potential asset. Morrison's team found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Their training emphasized never abandoning teammates or civilians under their protection, but Sarah was actively volunteering to surrender herself to save others. Military regulations provided no guidance for scenarios where the person being protected chose to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Colonel Williams monitored the situation with growing frustration from the base command center. Reinforcements remained tied down by continuing attacks on other coalition positions, and weather conditions prevented air support from reaching the landing zone. The diversionary attacks had failed to draw significant enemy forces away from Morrison's position. As midnight approached, Nazir set a deadline for Morrison's decision. The Taliban commander claimed that his patience was limited, and continuing fighting would likely result in casualties among the medical personnel and patients that both sides wanted to avoid. The ultimatum forced Morrison to confront the most difficult decision of his military career. Sarah used the remaining time to provide Morrison with detailed medical instructions for caring for her patients if she was taken. She wrote out medication schedules, treatment protocols, and emergency procedures on whatever paper she could find. Her dedication to her patients' welfare continued even as she prepared for an uncertain fate. The SEAL team gathered around Morrison as he wrestled with the decision. Each man understood the implications of whatever choice their commander made. Surrendering Sarah violated everything they believed about protecting civilians, but forcing a firefight could result in the deaths of everyone they were trying to save, Marcus reported. Intercepted communications suggesting that additional Taliban forces were moving into position around the base perimeter. Time was running out for any potential rescue operation, and the enemy's tactical advantage was only growing stronger. The window for conventional military solutions was rapidly closing. As Morrison prepared to respond to Nazir's ultimatum, an unexpected development changed the entire situation. One of the wounded children, the young girl who still clutched her wooden doll, regained consciousness and began speaking weakly in her native language. Her words, translated by an interpreter monitoring the radio communications, would provide the key to resolving the crisis in a way no one had anticipated. The child's simple request would inspire Morrison to make a decision that went against all military training but honored the deepest principles of human courage and sacrifice. The young girl's whispered words cut through the darkness like a prayer. Speaking in Pashto, she asked if the kind doctor who had saved her life would stay with her until her father came to take her home. The base interpreter, monitoring communications, translated her innocent request with a voice heavy with emotion. Everyone listening understood that her father would never come. He had died in the same explosion that nearly killed her. Sarah knelt beside the child, gently stroking her hair while explaining in simple words that she would stay as long as needed. The girl's trust and innocence in the midst of such violence affected everyone within hearing, including Hassan Nazir, whose own radio had picked up the exchange. For several long minutes, the Taliban commander remained silent. Morrison watched Sarah comfort the wounded child and realized that this moment embodied everything they were fighting for. Here was a doctor who had risked everything to save lives, a young girl whose innocence had survived unthinkable trauma, and warriors from both sides who found themselves questioning the nature of their conflict. When Nazir finally spoke again, his voice carried a different tone. The Taliban commander revealed that he had children of his own, daughters who were roughly the same age as the wounded girl. Hearing the child's request for her father had reminded him of why he believed he was fighting this war. His next words surprised everyone listening. "American commander," Nazir said slowly, "I have been thinking about your doctor and these children. Perhaps there is another way to resolve our situation that honors both our causes and protects innocent life." Morrison remained cautious, but Nazir's proposal was unlike anything he had expected. The Taliban commander suggested a temporary ceasefire that would allow medical evacuations to continue for all wounded, regardless of their affiliation. In exchange, Dr. Martinez would agree to treat Taliban wounded at a neutral location, demonstrating that medical care transcended political boundaries. Sarah immediately expressed her willingness to accept such an arrangement. Her medical oath, she explained, required her to treat all patients regardless of their background or beliefs. She had always believed that medicine could build bridges between enemies, and this situation offered a chance to prove that principle under the most challenging circumstances. However, Morrison knew that military regulations strictly forbade such arrangements with enemy forces. Allowing Sarah to treat Taliban fighters would violate numerous policies and could be seen as providing aid to enemy combatants. The decision required him to choose between following orders and following his conscience. The conversation was interrupted by reports from the base command center. Coalition forces had identified the locations of several Taliban positions, and air support was finally becoming available. Colonel Williams informed Morrison that they could launch a coordinated attack within 30 minutes, potentially ending the siege but almost certainly resulting in casualties. Morrison found himself at the center of a moral dilemma that would define his career and possibly his life. Military training demanded that he maintain his defensive position and wait for reinforcement, but Sarah's willingness to risk everything for her patients suggested there might be a better way forward. Sarah made the decision easier by announcing her intention to accept Nazir's proposal regardless of military approval. She stated that her medical oath superseded military regulations when it came to saving lives. If Morrison and his team chose to prevent her from helping wounded Taliban fighters, she would consider them obstacles to her medical mission. The SEAL team watched their commander wrestle with an impossible choice. Every man understood the implications of whatever decision Morrison made. Supporting Sarah's proposal could end their military careers, but preventing her from saving lives would violate the principles that had motivated them to become special operations soldiers. Morrison's decision shocked everyone, including his own team. Speaking clearly into the radio so that both Nazir and Colonel Williams could hear, he announced that his team would lay down their weapons and escort Dr. Martinez to treat wounded fighters from both sides. They would trust in the Taliban commander's honor and the universal principles of medical neutrality. "We're going to step into the crossfire," Morrison told his team, "not as soldiers but as human beings committed to protecting someone who saves lives. Anyone who can't accept that decision is free to return to base." Not a single member of Morrison's team moved toward the base. Marcus, Tony, Alex, Chris, and David all confirmed their willingness to follow their commander into an unprecedented situation. They would accompany Sarah as protectors rather than combatants, trusting in principles that transcended military doctrine. Nazir accepted Morrison's proposal with what sounded like genuine respect in his voice. The Taliban commander agreed to establish a temporary medical station in a neutral location where Dr. Martinez could treat wounded from both sides. Taliban fighters would provide security alongside the unarmed SEAL team, creating an alliance born of shared commitment to preserving life. Sarah gathered her medical supplies while Morrison's team prepared to abandon their weapons, a decision that went against every instinct developed through years of combat training. They would venture into Taliban-controlled territory armed only with medical equipment and the hope that human decency could overcome the hatred of, or Colonel Williams monitored the unprecedented arrangement. With a mixture of admiration and terror, he was witnessing either the most courageous act in military history or the most catastrophic violation of protocol. Only time would tell whether Morrison's decision would save lives or cost them everything. As the group prepared to leave the safety of the landing zone, Sarah looked back at the wounded child who had innocently asked for her father. The girl smiled weakly and clutched her wooden doll, unaware that her simple request had inspired warriors to choose healing over hatred. The stage was set for an extraordinary demonstration of courage that would challenge everyone's understanding of warfare, duty, and the power of human compassion in the face of seemingly insurmountable hatred. The walk through no man's land felt like stepping into another world. Commander Morrison and his team moved slowly through the darkness, their hands empty of weapons for the first time in years of combat operations. Dr. Sarah Martinez walked between them, carrying her medical bag with the same determination she had shown throughout the crisis. The sound of their footsteps on rocky ground seemed impossibly loud in the mountain silence. Taliban fighters emerged from concealed positions as the group approached the designated meeting point. Hassan Nazir himself stood waiting, flanked by several of his men who watched the approaching Americans with curiosity rather than hostility. The Taliban commander was younger than Morrison had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to assess everything around him. Sarah stepped forward first, introducing herself in basic Pashto she had learned during her time in Afghanistan. Nazir responded in English, welcoming her with formal courtesy while acknowledging Morrison and his team with respectful nods. The surreal nature of the meeting was not lost on anyone. Present, sworn enemies gathering to facilitate medical care in the middle of an active war zone. The temporary medical station had been established in a partially destroyed building that offered protection from wind and observation. Taliban fighters had arranged crude lighting and cleared debris to create a workspace, while several wounded men lay waiting on improvised stretchers. Sarah immediately began assessing their injuries, her professional demeanor unchanged despite the extraordinary circumstances. Morrison's team took defensive positions around the medical area, but their role had fundamentally changed. Instead of preparing to engage enemy forces, they were now protecting a doctor who was treating those same enemies. The psychological adjustment challenged everything they thought they knew about their mission and purpose. Sarah worked through the night, treating gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and infections that had gone untreated for days. Her patients included Taliban fighters, coalition soldiers, and civilians caught in the crossfire. She made no distinction between them, applying the same skill and compassion to each case regardless of uniform or allegiance. Nazir observed Sarah's work with growing admiration. He had expected to find an American propaganda tool, but instead discovered a genuine healer whose dedication transcended political boundaries. During quiet moments between treatments, he shared stories of his own motivation for fighting, revealing a complex man driven by genuine belief rather than simple hatred. The most challenging case arrived near dawn, a young Taliban fighter who had been shot in the chest during the earlier fighting. Sarah worked frantically to save his life, assisted by Chris, Morrison's medic, who had volunteered to help despite the ethical complications. Together, they performed emergency surgery that would have been impossible without their combined skills. As word spread of the unprecedented medical cooperation, fighters from both sides began arriving with wounded comrades. The temporary ceasefire that had begun as a desperate solution evolved into something larger, a demonstration that even in war, human compassion could create bridges between enemies. Morrison found himself in conversation with Taliban fighters who spoke of their families, their hopes for Afghanistan's future, and their respect for Dr. Martinez's courage. These interactions challenged his understanding of the enemy, revealing individuals driven by conviction rather than mere hatred for America and coalition forces. Sarah saved 7 lives during that long night, including 3 Taliban fighters, 2 coalition soldiers, and 2 civilians. Each successful treatment strengthened the fragile trust that had developed between the opposing groups. When she finally stepped back from her makeshift operating table, exhaustion was written across her face, but her eyes held satisfaction. As sunrise painted the mountains in shades of gold and red, Nazir made an announcement that surprised everyone. He declared a unilateral ceasefire for his forces, allowing coalition medical evacuations to proceed without interference. The Taliban commander stated that Dr. Martinez had proven that healing was more powerful than hatred, and he would not target medical personnel again. The arrangement that had begun as a desperate solution to save lives had evolved into something unprecedented in the Afghan conflict. Morrison's decision to trust in human decency rather than military force had created a brief moment of peace in an otherwise brutal war. The impact would extend far beyond that single night. Sarah insisted on returning to treat the wounded children at the base before accepting evacuation herself. Nazir provided safe escort for the group, personally ensuring their protection until they reached coalition lines. The Taliban commander's final words to Morrison expressed hope that other soldiers might find the courage to choose healing over hatred. The official military investigation that followed was complex and controversial. Morrison and his team faced questions about their decision to abandon protocol and trust enemy forces. However, the successful treatment of numerous casualties and the unprecedented ceasefire made it difficult to characterize their actions as anything other than heroic. Dr. Sarah Martinez returned to the United States 3 weeks later, but her experience in Afghanistan had changed her forever. She established a foundation dedicated to training military medical personnel in conflict resolution and cross-cultural medical ethics. Her story became a powerful example of how individual courage could transcend political boundaries. Morrison received both commendation and criticism for his unconventional decision-making. Military analysts debated whether his actions represented dangerous precedent or innovative leadership. However, none could argue with the results. Lives had been saved, and a moment of humanity had emerged from the darkness of war. The wooden doll that the young Afghan girl had clutched throughout her ordeal was eventually returned to her after her full recovery. She kept it as a reminder of the night when a doctor's courage and warrior's compassion proved that even in the midst of conflict, the commitment to preserve life could unite the most bitter enemies in common purpose. Years later, when military historians studied the incident, they would struggle to categorize it within conventional understanding of warfare. Instead, they would recognize it as an extraordinary example of what could happen when individuals chose to step beyond the boundaries of their training and trust in the fundamental goodness of human nature. Even in humanity's darkest moments,